So, you brought something really, really interesting for us to kind of dig into today. And, it's pretty big topic. How Islam views Jesus.
Yeah.
I mean, this source is really trying to figure out, if Islam truly has this reverence for Jesus that a lot of people talk about, or if maybe, there's a different way to look at it. And honestly, it seems like this source is leaning towards that second idea, that, maybe it's not all about reverence after all.
Yeah, exactly. And we're going to, go through the different arguments that this piece is making, right? Like, we have stuff from the Quran, and then there's some parts from the Hadith, which is basically, what the Prophet Muhammad said and did, all those stories and teachings. And then, we even have some good old Bible verses thrown in there. It's like this really, really interesting mix, all to try and, see how this whole question of reverence actually works.
So basically what we're doing here is like taking apart all the little pieces of this source. We're trying to understand what it's really saying about Jesus and Islam, and why it's questioning that whole reverence thing. And we're doing it all based on what this source actually gives us.
Yeah, and the best way to start, I think, is to begin where the source itself begins, right? Like acknowledging that Islam actually does mention Jesus or Isa, and sometimes it does sound pretty respectful.
Yeah, I mean, like the source even points out Quran 3.45, right? This verse, it talks about how Mary was told about a word from Allah, and this word, his name is going to be the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, and he's going to be honored in this world and the next, and he'll be one of those close to Allah. I mean, when you read that, it definitely sounds like there's some serious respect there.
It totally does, yeah. Like you could read that and think, okay, there's a lot of respect going on here, but the source, kind of changes gears pretty quickly. It starts saying that maybe that first impression isn't the whole story.
Okay, so let's get into the nitty-gritty of this whole argument. Like, what are the big things that this source is saying are actually kind of like undercutting that whole idea of reverence?
Well, the source lays out several points, right? But the first one, the really big one, is how Jesus is actually understood. Like there's this huge difference, right? It compares that Christian belief that Jesus is divine, like in John 1.1, where it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And then it compares that with how the Quran talks about Jesus.
So how does the Quran portray Jesus? Like, how is it different?
Well, the source pulls out Quran 5.75, which says the Messiah, son of Mary, was no more than a messenger. Many messengers passed away before him. And it also brings up Quran 4.171, the one that says, so do not say three, desist. It is better for you. Indeed, Allah is but one God. And the source is saying, look, these verses, they're clearly rejecting that Jesus is divine, and they're rejecting the whole Trinity idea, that Christian doctrine where God is one being, but three persons, Father, Son, Holy Spirit, like what they talk about in Matthew 28.19. So the source is basically arguing that by calling Jesus just a messenger, Islam is, taking away his divinity. It's like they're taking him from being the son of God and making him just another prophet, a human one.
So their point is, like, even if you use fancy titles, it doesn't really mean true reverence if, like, who that person really is totally changed.
Exactly, yeah. The source is saying that this isn't actually lifting Jesus up. It's more like putting him in a different category, one where, he's not divine anymore, at least according to Christian belief. And then, after that, the source starts talking about how Muhammad is the seal of the prophets, which is in Quran 33.40.
And how does this whole idea of Muhammad being the last prophet, play into the argument about Jesus?
Well, the source is saying that seal of the prophets means that Muhammad is like the final prophet, the ultimate one. And because of that, his message is, the most important. It comes after and kind of completes all the other revelations, even Jesus's. So, from that viewpoint, Muhammad has like a higher position in God's plan. He's more important.
Gotcha. So first you have the denial of Jesus being divine, and then you have this idea that Muhammad is the final, like the most important prophet. What else does the source bring up?
Well, the next big point is about the crucifixion and the resurrection, how Islam sees those events. The source looks at Quran 4.157, where it says, they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but it was made to appear so to them. And then Quran 4.158, which says, Rather, Allah raised him to himself.
And I'm guessing the source is like putting those verses right next to what Christians believe about Jesus dying and coming back to life. Right?
Exactly. It's comparing them to verses like Mark 15.37, which talks about Jesus dying on the cross, and then 1 Corinthians 15.4, which says that he rose from the dead on the third day. That's a super important part of what Christians believe. And then the source kind of dives into what all of this means for Christians. It points out that the crucifixion is like the heart of the atonement idea, the belief that Jesus dying on the cross was a sacrifice to like fix things between people and God, to make up for their sins. It's like what Romans 5.8 talks about.
And what about Islam not believing in the resurrection? What does the source say about that?
Well, the source brings up 1 Corinthians 15.17, where it basically says that if there's no resurrection, then Christian faith is pointless. And then it points to some Islamic traditions, like the one in Tafsir Ibn Kathir, which is like a commentary on the Quran, a really respected one, where it says that someone else was made to look like Jesus and got crucified instead of him. So, the source is basically saying that this whole Islamic story is completely different from how Christians see those events. It's a totally different way of understanding what happened to Jesus and, what it means for everyone.
So by saying that Jesus wasn't crucified and didn't rise from the dead, the source is arguing that Islam is basically rejecting what's most important about who Jesus is and what he did, at least from a Christian viewpoint.
Yeah, that's exactly it. It's shifting the focus away from Jesus sacrificing himself and coming back to life, which the source is saying ends up putting more emphasis on Muhammad and his importance in Islam. And then the source takes it a step further. It starts comparing, not just the ideas, but also how Jesus and Muhammad actually lived, what they did.
Okay, this is where I feel like things are going to get, a little more intense, maybe even a bit controversial.
Yeah.
So how does the source approach this whole comparison thing?
Well, it takes specific examples from both Islamic and Christian texts to like show what it sees as these really big differences in their morals and behavior. Like, for example, it brings up a hadith from Sahih Bukhari that's 4.52.220, where Muhammad supposedly said, "I have been sent to perfect good character." And then it puts that right next to what Jesus taught in Matthew 5.44, which is to love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So the source is suggesting that this shows a fundamental difference. Like Jesus is all about this radical love, even for your enemies, and it's not about getting revenge.
And then I'm guessing the source goes into, some of those parts of Muhammad's life that people debate about.
Yeah, it does. It talks about how Muhammad married Aisha, and it mentions Sahih Bukhari 7.62.64, the part that focuses on their age difference when they got married. And the source presents this as a problem. It even connects it to what it calls the legalization of pedophilia in Islamic law.
So what else does it bring up in this comparison?
Well, it also talks about how Muhammad supposedly approved of people killing those who criticized him. It points to Sahih Muslim 19.4294, specifically the story of Ka'b bin al-Ashraf. And it quotes what Allah's messenger said: "Who is willing to kill Ka'b bin al-Ashraf, who has annoyed Allah and his apostle?" So according to the source, this shows that Muhammad was, okay with using violence against people who opposed him. And then the source quotes Quran 9.5, that verse of the sword where it says, "Fight and kill the disbelievers wherever you find them." And it compares that with what Jesus said in John 18.36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting." It's highlighting this really different approach to power and fighting,
And I'm assuming, to make that difference even clearer, the source talks about how Jesus' followers acted too, right?
Exactly. It looks at passages like Acts 4.3235, which talks about how the first Christians were all about being united, sharing what they had and living peacefully together. And the source presents this as like the opposite of the examples he gave about Muhammad. It's suggesting there are two really different ways of leading and building a community.
Okay, so after going through all these theological differences and showing these contrasting examples of, how Jesus and Muhammad acted, what does the source conclude? Like, what's the main takeaway?
Well, it concludes that because Islam says Jesus wasn't divine, didn't die on the cross, and didn't come back to life, and because it presents Muhammad as this different kind of figure, it's basically undermining who Jesus is and what he was all about, at least for Christians. So the source is arguing that from a Christian perspective, you can't really say that Islam genuinely reveres Jesus. It even goes as far as saying that any apparent respect for Jesus in Islam, it's actually just a way to make Muhammad look more important and say that Islam is better.
Wow, so this source is not mincing words, huh? It's pretty straightforward about its opinion.
Yeah, it really is. It's saying that these aren't just little disagreements about theology, they're like massive contradictions that mean Islam can't really claim to truly revere Jesus, not in the way Christians understand it. The source is basically saying that true respect would mean accepting those core beliefs about Jesus, not changing them to fit into a different religion.
So as we, wrap up our deep dive into this source, I think we can see that tension it's highlighting. On one hand, you have Islam saying that Jesus was an important prophet. But then on the other hand, this source is saying that all these fundamental differences about his divinity, his death, his resurrection, and then comparing him to Muhammad, it all shows that the relationship is not really about genuine reverence, at least not from a Christian viewpoint.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. The source is really emphasizing how the basic beliefs are just so different that even if they sound similar sometimes, when you really look at it, you get these two totally different pictures of Jesus and Muhammad.
And, the big question this source leaves us with is, can you really call it shared reverence? I mean, it's suggesting that what might look like respect is actually, something else entirely. It's really making you think about those huge differences this source is pointing out between these two religions, differences that maybe can't be resolved. And it definitely gives you a lot to think about in terms of how different religions can, understand each other.
For sure. It's pushing us to go deeper, not just look for the things they have in common, but really examine those core beliefs and values that shape how each religion understands these important figures and events. It's really fascinating,
It is. It is.
Makes you think.
Yeah. Well, thanks for bringing this piece to us. It's definitely been a really interesting deep dive.
My pleasure. Always happy to kind of, explore these things and see what we can learn from them.
Absolutely. Until next time.
Revere.